The morning mist clung to the gardens of Windsor Castle like a gentle veil, obscuring the ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal transitions. Prince William stood at the window of his private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes his grandmother had loved so dearly. The weight of recent conversations with his father pressed heavily on his shoulders, each word echoing in his mind like the distant chimes of Big Ben. 3 months had passed since King Charles had first mentioned the idea during their private dinner at Highgrove House. The conversation had begun innocuously enough, with discussions about upcoming state visits and the children's school activities. But, as the evening wore on and the staff had retreated, leaving father and son alone with their thoughts and a bottle of aged whiskey, Charles had broached the subject that would forever alter the trajectory of both their lives. "William," his father had said, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, "I've been giving considerable thought to the future of the monarchy. Not just the distant future, but the immediate years ahead." The pause that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, filled only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. William had sensed the gravity of what was to come. His father's face bore the unmistakable lines of a man who had carried the crown's burden for what felt like both a lifetime and mere moments. The transition from Prince of Wales to King had been seamless to the public eye, but those closest to Charles could see the toll it had taken. The sleepless nights spent reviewing state papers, the careful navigation of political sensitivities, and the constant awareness that every word, every gesture, every decision would be scrutinized by millions. "I believe it's time to begin a gradual transition," Charles had continued, his voice steady but tinged with something William couldn't quite identify. Was it relief? Apprehension? Perhaps both. Not an abdication, mind you, but a careful, measured passing of daily responsibilities. The people need to see continuity, stability. They need to know that the institution they trust will endure. The proposal had been both shocking and oddly inevitable. William had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, yet when it arrived, it felt surreal. The weight of kingship had always been a distant mountain on the horizon, something he would eventually climb but not something that demanded immediate attention. Now, suddenly, that mountain loomed large and immediate. Catherine had been the first person he'd confided in when he returned to Adelaide Cottage that night. She was in their bedroom, reading a novel by the soft light of her bedside lamp, her hair falling in gentle waves over her shoulders. The domesticity of the scene struck him as precious and fragile, knowing that their private moments would soon become even more scarce and guarded. "How do you feel about it?" she had asked after he'd explained his father's proposal. Her voice carried the weight of understanding, for she too had been preparing for this transition, though perhaps not quite so soon. Terrified and ready at the same time, William had admitted, sitting on the edge of their bed. "I've known this day would come my entire life, but somehow I thought we'd have more time. More time for the children to grow up away from the spotlight, more time for us to simply be ourselves." Catherine had reached for his hand, her touch grounding him as it always did. "We'll face it together, as we always have. And perhaps it's better this way, gradual rather than sudden. We can learn and adapt as we go." Over the following weeks, a series of carefully orchestrated meetings began to take place behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace. The Queen's private secretary, the Prime Minister, and other key figures in the constitutional machinery were briefed on the proposed transition. Each conversation required delicate handling, for while the monarchy had weathered many changes throughout its long history, a voluntary transfer of power from a healthy, capable monarch to his heir was unprecedented in modern times. The children had been the most challenging aspect to navigate. George, at 10 years old, was beginning to understand the weight of his future destiny, but Charlotte and Louis remained blissfully unaware of the full implications. William and Catherine had decided to tell them gradually, age-appropriately, ensuring that their childhood remained as normal as possible even as their father's role in public life began to expand. "Will you still have time to help me with my football practice?" George had asked one evening as William tucked him into bed. The question had pierced William's heart, for it encapsulated everything he feared about the transition. The loss of those precious, ordinary moments that made him feel like a father first and a future king second. "I'll always make time for what matters most," William had promised, meaning every word but knowing the reality would be more complicated than his assurance suggested. The first public indication of the transition came during a state banquet for the visiting president of France. Traditionally, such events were hosted entirely by the reigning monarch, but, this time, King Charles had invited William to take a more prominent role in the proceedings. The media noticed immediately, with royal correspondents speculating about the significance of the Prince of Wales's elevated position during the formal dinner. William had felt every eye upon him as he delivered his first major speech in this new capacity. The words had been carefully crafted by a team of speechwriters, but he had insisted on adding personal touches that reflected his own vision for the monarchy's future. He spoke of continuity and change, of honoring tradition while embracing the needs of a modern commonwealth. The applause that followed felt different somehow, more weighted with expectation and hope. In the days that followed, the palace's communications team worked overtime to manage the narrative. They released carefully worded statements about the king's desire to gradually share more responsibilities with the Prince of Wales as part of a natural evolution of royal duties. The public response was largely positive, with many expressing appreciation for the transparency and forward-thinking approach. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was far more complex. William found himself attending briefings that had previously been the sole domain of his father. Economic reports, security assessments, diplomatic cables, the sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Each document represented real consequences for real people, decisions that would ripple across the Commonwealth and beyond. One particularly challenging morning involved a crisis in one of the Caribbean realms, where a political situation threatened to destabilize the region. William sat in the secure briefing room at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by advisors and cabinet ministers, as they discussed the delicate balance between constitutional monarchy and political neutrality. The young prince found himself thinking of his grandmother, wondering how she had navigated such treacherous waters with such grace for over 70 years. "Your Majesty," one of the advisors had said, addressing King Charles, "we need a response within the hour." But Charles had looked directly at his son. "I believe this falls under the Prince of Wales's expanded purview. William, how would you like to proceed?" The moment had crystallized everything about the transition. Not just the transfer of titles or ceremonies, but the real, weighty responsibility of decisions that could affect millions of lives. William had felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest, but also something else, a clarity of purpose that surprised him. The decision he made that day, regarding the Caribbean situation, would later be praised by constitutional scholars as showing wisdom beyond his years. But, in the moment, sitting in that briefing room with all eyes upon him, William simply tried to remember the lessons his grandmother had taught him about service, duty, and the careful balance of power. As autumn approached, the transition began to accelerate. William's calendar became increasingly packed with engagements that had traditionally been the king's responsibility. State visits, investiture ceremonies, meetings with Commonwealth leaders, each event was another step in his preparation for the ultimate role he would one day fully assume. The most emotionally challenging moment came during a private dinner at Sandringham, just the immediate family gathered around the table where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. King Charles raised his glass and offered a toast that seemed to acknowledge what everyone present understood but hadn't yet fully articulated. "To family," he said simply, "and to the future." But his eyes met William's across the table, and in that look was a passing of something indefinable but profound. Not just a crown or a title, but the accumulated weight of generations, the hopes and expectations of millions, and the sacred trust placed in their family by history itself. As they left Sandringham that evening, William walked through the gardens where he had played as a child, where his own children now ran and laughed during family visits. The responsibility felt heavier with each step, but so did his resolve. The boy who had once been reluctant to embrace his destiny was gradually becoming the man who would lead not just a nation, but a commonwealth of nations into an uncertain but hopeful future. The autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet as he made his way back to the car, Catherine walking beside him in comfortable silence. Tomorrow would bring another day of briefings, another set of decisions, another step in the most gradual and careful transfer of power in the monarchy's modern history. But, tonight, walking through the gardens of his childhood, Prince William allowed himself one last moment to simply be a son, a husband, and a father before the world asked him to be something more. The first real test of William's expanded role came unexpectedly on a cold February morning when news broke of a devastating earthquake in one of the Commonwealth nations. The images flooding the news channels were heartbreaking: collapsed buildings, families searching through rubble, children crying for their parents. William was in his study at Kensington Palace, reviewing briefing papers for an upcoming trade mission, when his private secretary knocked urgently on the door. "Sir, we need your immediate attention," she said, her usually calm demeanor betraying the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, William found himself in a secure video conference with emergency coordinators, diplomatic officials, and aid organizations. King Charles was traveling in Scotland, attending to a separate engagement, and, for the first time, William was truly the point person for a major international crisis. The next 72 hours would prove to be a crucible that transformed William's understanding of what it meant to be a modern monarch. He worked alongside government ministers to coordinate humanitarian aid, spoke directly with the affected nation's prime minister, and authorized the immediate deployment of Royal Navy ships carrying emergency supplies and medical personnel. But, perhaps most importantly, he had to be the face of compassion and leadership that the public needed to see during such tragic times. Standing in the BBC studios at Broadcasting House, preparing for his first major crisis address as the acting head of the monarchy, William felt the weight of history upon his shoulders. His grandmother had given similar addresses during times of national and international tragedy, her steady voice providing comfort and reassurance to millions. Now it was his turn to find the right words, the right tone, the right balance between acknowledging the tragedy and offering hope. "My thoughts and prayers are with all those affected by this devastating earthquake," he began, looking directly into the camera. "In times like these, we are reminded of our shared humanity and our responsibility to stand with those who suffer." The words felt inadequate against the magnitude of the tragedy, but he pressed on, drawing strength from the knowledge that his voice carried the authority and compassion of the crown. The public response was immediate and largely positive. Social media filled with messages of support, not just for the earthquake victims, but for William's handling of the crisis. Royal correspondents noted the seamless way he had stepped into the role, managing both the practical and emotional aspects of the disaster response. But, for William, the true measure of success wasn't in the headlines, it was in the updates he received from the disaster zone, reports of lives saved and communities beginning to rebuild. Catherine had been his anchor throughout those intense days. She took on additional royal duties to free up his schedule, managed the children's questions about why Daddy was so busy and worried, and provided the emotional support he needed during late-night phone calls with crisis coordinators. Their partnership, already strong, deepened under the pressure of these new responsibilities. "You were magnificent," she told him on the evening after the crisis had stabilized. They were finally alone in their sitting room at Adelaide Cottage, the children asleep upstairs, the emergency phone silent for the first time in days. "I could see your grandmother's strength in you today." The mention of his grandmother brought a bittersweet smile to William's face. He had felt her presence throughout the crisis, almost as if she were guiding his decisions and words. The weight of carrying on her legacy was immense, but so was the sense of purpose it provided. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. King Charles, perhaps recognizing how well William had handled the earthquake crisis, began to delegate even more significant responsibilities. Constitutional meetings that had been the monarch's exclusive domain now included the Prince of Wales. Foreign diplomats who had grown accustomed to dealing primarily with King Charles found themselves working more frequently with his son. One particularly significant moment came during a state visit from the President of the United States. The relationship between Britain and America had always been crucial to both nations, and royal protocol demanded that such visits be handled with perfect precision. William found himself not just participating in the ceremonial aspects, but actively involved in the substantive discussions about trade, security, and climate change. During a private dinner at Windsor Castle, the American president pulled William aside for what would become a pivotal conversation. "Your father speaks very highly of your judgment," the president said, "and, frankly, from what I've observed today, I can see why. The world is watching this transition with great interest. It's not often we get to witness such a thoughtful approach to leadership succession." The comment stayed with William long after the state visit concluded. The idea that the world was watching, judging not just his individual performance but the monarchy's ability to evolve and adapt, added another layer of pressure to his already heavy responsibilities. But it also reinforced his determination to prove that the institution could remain relevant and effective in the modern world. The children were adapting to their father's increased prominence in ways that were both touching and concerning. George, now showing signs of the serious-mindedness that seemed to run in the family, began asking more sophisticated questions about duty and service. Charlotte displayed a natural empathy that reminded William of his mother, often asking about the people they were trying to help through various charitable initiatives. Louis, still young enough to be largely oblivious to the broader implications, simply missed having his father around for bedtime stories and weekend football games. One evening, as William was putting Louis to bed, his youngest son asked with the brutal honesty that only children possess, "Daddy, are you going to be too important to play with me?" The question hit William like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the personal costs of his expanding role. He spent extra time that night reassuring Louis that no amount of duty or responsibility would ever be more important than being his father. The summer brought the most significant test yet of the transition arrangement. The annual Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was scheduled to take place in London, and, for the first time, William would serve as the primary host alongside King Charles. The meeting would bring together leaders from 54 nations, each with their own expectations and agendas, each looking to the British monarchy for leadership and stability. Preparations began months in advance, with William immersing himself in briefing papers about each attending nation's political situation, economic challenges, and relationships with the Commonwealth. He met with former prime ministers, constitutional experts, and diplomatic historians, trying to absorb decades of institutional knowledge in a matter of months. The pressure was immense, not just because of the international attention, but because some Commonwealth leaders were openly questioning whether the monarchy remained relevant to their modern, democratic societies. William knew that his performance during this meeting could influence the future of the Commonwealth itself. The opening ceremony at Buckingham Palace was a masterclass in royal pageantry, but, beneath the surface glamour, serious work was taking place. William found himself in bilateral meetings with prime ministers and presidents, discussing everything from trade disputes to climate change initiatives. Each conversation required careful preparation and delicate handling, balancing the monarchy's traditional neutrality with the need to advance British interests and Commonwealth unity. One particularly challenging moment came during a meeting with several Caribbean leaders who were seriously considering transitioning their nations to republican forms of government. The discussion was frank and, sometimes uncomfortable, touching on historical grievances and contemporary relevance. "With respect, Your Royal Highness," one Prime Minister said, "many of our citizens question whether a hereditary monarch based in London can truly represent their interests and aspirations in the 21st century." William's response would later be studied by constitutional scholars and diplomats. Rather than defending the traditional arguments for monarchy, he acknowledged the legitimacy of their concerns and spoke about the evolving role of the institution. "I understand those questions completely," he said, "because they're questions I ask myself every day. The monarchy's relevance cannot be based on tradition alone, it must be earned through service, understanding, and genuine partnership. If we cannot demonstrate that value, then we do not deserve your continued confidence." The honesty of his response surprised some in the room and impressed others. Several leaders later commented privately that they had been expecting defensive rhetoric and, instead received thoughtful engagement with their fundamental concerns. As the Commonwealth meeting progressed, William found his confidence growing. The careful preparation, the years of gradual experience, and the trust his father had shown in him were all paying dividends. He was not just representing the monarchy, he was beginning to define what the monarchy could become under his eventual leadership. The final day of the meeting brought an unexpected crisis when a trade dispute between two Commonwealth nations threatened to overshadow the entire gathering. Traditional diplomatic channels had failed to resolve the issue, and both sides were threatening to withdraw from key Commonwealth trade agreements. William found himself in the unusual position of serving as mediator between two sovereign leaders, drawing on both his formal authority as the future head of the Commonwealth and his personal relationships built over years of royal visits and state occasions. The resolution he helped craft wasn't perfect, but it prevented a complete breakdown in Commonwealth cooperation. More importantly, it demonstrated the monarchy's potential to serve as an honest broker in international disputes, using its unique position outside traditional political structures to facilitate dialogue and compromise. King Charles watched the entire Commonwealth meeting with evident pride, but also with what some observers noted was a sense of relief. The burden he had carried alone for so long was being shared, and shared effectively. The institution that meant so much to him was in capable hands for the future. As the summer evening drew to a close and the last Commonwealth leader departed from London, William stood once again at a palace window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The boy who had once dreaded public attention had become a man who could command a room full of world leaders. The reluctant heir had transformed into someone who was beginning to embrace the possibility that he might actually make a difference in the world. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. For the first time since his father had first mentioned the transition, William found himself looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than dreading them. The crown that had once seemed like an unbearable burden was beginning to feel like an opportunity to serve something greater than himself. The autumn of the transition year brought with it a profound shift in the public's perception of Prince William and, by extension, the monarchy itself. What had begun as a careful, almost cautious transfer of responsibilities had evolved into something more significant, a reimagining of what royal leadership could look like in the modern era. This transformation became most apparent during William's handling of a national crisis that would test every lesson he had learned and every instinct he had developed. The crisis began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning when news broke of a severe economic downturn affecting working families across Britain. Rising energy costs, coupled with supply chain disruptions and housing affordability issues, had created a perfect storm of financial hardship. Unlike previous economic challenges that were primarily the government's responsibility to address, this crisis touched on issues that had long been central to William's charitable work and personal mission. For years, through his various patronages and initiatives, William had focused on homelessness, mental health, and environmental sustainability. Now, these individual concerns were converging into a broader social crisis that demanded not just charitable response, but moral leadership. The question facing both the palace and the public was whether the monarchy could provide that leadership without overstepping constitutional boundaries. William's response began not with grand speeches or formal announcements, but with a series of unannounced visits to communities across the country. He traveled to food banks in Manchester, homeless shelters in Birmingham, and community centres in Scotland where families were struggling to heat their homes. These visits were different from traditional royal engagements. There was less ceremony, more genuine conversation, and a palpable sense of urgency. During one particularly moving encounter at a community centre in Liverpool, William sat with a single mother named Sarah who was working 2 jobs but still couldn't afford adequate housing for her 3 children. As she described her daily struggles, choosing between heating and food, explaining to her children why they couldn't have new school clothes, lying awake at night worrying about eviction, William found himself thinking not about royal protocol or political neutrality, but about his own children sleeping safely in their warm beds at home. What would help most, he asked Sarah directly, setting aside the prepared questions his staff had suggested. Hope, she replied without hesitation. Just knowing that someone who has the power to make a difference actually understands what we're going through. That conversation would prove to be a turning point, not just in William's approach to his role, but in the public's understanding of what he represented. The traditional model of royal duty, appearing at ceremonial events, cutting ribbons, making polite small talk, felt inadequate in the face of such genuine human need. Working with his advisors, William developed what they privately called the Sarah Principle. Every initiative, every speech, every decision would be measured against whether it would actually make a difference to someone like Sarah and her children. This principle would guide his actions throughout the remainder of the crisis and beyond. The next phase of his response was more controversial. Working within the constitutional constraints that prevented him from making political statements, William began using his platform to highlight specific issues and solutions. He visited innovative housing projects that demonstrated affordable, sustainable building techniques. He toured businesses that had found ways to support their workers during difficult times. He met with community leaders who had developed creative approaches to local challenges. Each visit was carefully documented and shared through the royal family's social media channels, but these weren't typical royal photographs. Instead of formal posed shots, the images captured William engaged in genuine conversation, listening intently, sometimes looking troubled by what he was learning. The contrast with traditional royal imagery was striking and intentional. The palace's communications team worked overtime to manage the delicate balance between advocacy and political neutrality. Every statement was carefully crafted to highlight problems and potential solutions without criticizing government policy or endorsing specific political positions. It was a tightrope walk that required unprecedented coordination between constitutional experts, communication specialists, and William's own growing political instincts. King Charles watched his son's evolution during this period with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. He recognized the genuine passion driving William's actions, but he also understood the risks inherent in a more activist approach to monarchy. The institution had survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The question was whether William's approach represented healthy evolution or dangerous deviation. The tension came to a head during a private meeting between father and son at Highgrove House. Charles had requested the meeting after reading newspaper editorials both praising and criticizing William's unprecedented activism. Some commentators celebrated the monarchy's apparent willingness to address real social issues, while others warned that political engagement, however well-intentioned, threatened the institution's carefully maintained neutrality. "I admire what you're trying to accomplish," Charles told his son as they walked through the gardens he had spent decades cultivating. "But we must be extremely careful not to compromise the monarchy's constitutional position. Our strength comes from being above politics, not from engaging with it." William listened respectfully to his father's concerns, but his response revealed how much his thinking had evolved since the transition began. "Father, I understand the traditional approach, and I respect the wisdom behind it. But I think we're facing a choice between relevance and neutrality. If the monarchy is seen as disconnected from the real struggles of ordinary people, if we're perceived as simply ceremonial figureheads with no understanding of modern life, then our neutrality won't matter because we won't matter." The conversation that followed was one of the most significant in their relationship. Charles shared stories from his own decades as Prince of Wales, describing his frustrations with the constraints of royal duty and his own evolution in understanding the institution's role. William spoke passionately about his vision for a monarchy that could serve as a force for positive change while still respecting constitutional boundaries. "I'm not trying to be a politician," William insisted. "I'm trying to be a leader. There's a difference between taking political positions and providing moral leadership during times of crisis." The debate reflected broader questions about the monarchy's role in contemporary society. Traditional constitutional monarchy emphasized the crown's symbolic function, representing continuity, stability, and national unity above the temporary divisions of politics. But William's approach suggested a more active interpretation of royal duty, one that saw moral leadership as compatible with, even essential to, constitutional monarchy. the public seemed increasingly supportive of William's approach. Polling data showed that his approval ratings had risen significantly during the crisis, particularly among younger demographics who had previously been skeptical of the monarchy's relevance. More importantly, the initiatives he had highlighted were generating real action. Businesses he had visited reported increased volunteer applications and donations. Housing projects he had toured received new funding from both government and private sources. Catherine played a crucial role in supporting William's evolving approach while helping to maintain the careful balance between activism and constitutional propriety. Her own royal duties increasingly complemented his crisis response, focusing on the educational and mental health impacts of economic hardship on children and families. Together, they developed a partnership approach that allowed them to address complex social issues from multiple angles while distributing the political risk. The children, now more aware of their father's heightened public profile, began asking more sophisticated questions about duty, privilege, and responsibility. George, in particular, seemed to grasp intuitively that their family's position came with obligations that extended beyond traditional ceremonial roles. During one family dinner, Charlotte asked why some children didn't have enough food when their family had so much. The question led to a conversation about inequality, responsibility, and the purpose of privilege that would have been unimaginable in previous generations of the royal family. William and Catherine found themselves explaining concepts of social justice and civic duty that their own royal education had largely overlooked. As winter approached, the economic crisis began to stabilize, but the changes in William's approach to royal duty had become permanent. He had discovered that the monarchy could be a powerful force for positive change without abandoning its constitutional role. The key was focusing on moral leadership rather than political advocacy, highlighting problems rather than prescribing specific policy solutions, and using the platform of the crown to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The transformation was perhaps most evident during the annual Christmas broadcast, a tradition that typically featured carefully neutral messages about faith, family, and service. William's contribution to the broadcast, delivered alongside his father, struck a different tone. While maintaining the traditional elements of hope and gratitude, he spoke directly about the struggles many families were facing and the responsibility of those with privilege to serve those without. This year has reminded us that true leadership is not about commanding from above, but about understanding from within, he said, speaking directly to the camera with an intensity that surprised viewers accustomed to more formal royal addresses. The crown's greatest power is not its authority, but its ability to shine light on both suffering and solutions. The response was immediate and largely positive. Social media filled with messages of support from people who felt, perhaps for the first time, that the royal family truly understood their struggles. Constitutional experts debated whether William had crossed any lines, but most agreed that he had found a way to be both politically neutral and morally engaged. As the year drew to a close, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in the British monarchy. The institution that had once seemed increasingly distant from modern life had found a way to become more relevant without sacrificing its essential character. William had proven that it was possible to be both a constitutional monarch and a moral leader, to respect political neutrality while still standing for principles of justice and compassion. But perhaps the most significant change was in William himself. The reluctant heir who had once dreaded public attention had become a leader who understood that his privilege came with profound responsibilities. He had learned to see the crown not as a burden to be endured, but as a tool for service that could make a real difference in people's lives. The boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, trying to disappear into himself while the world watched, had become a man who could stand before that same world with confidence and purpose. The transformation was not just personal, it was institutional, representing a new chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. The new year brought with it an unexpected challenge that would test not only William's growing leadership skills but also the very foundations of the constitutional monarchy he was learning to embody. A political crisis emerged when the government faced a vote of no confidence, triggered by revelations about economic mismanagement that had contributed to the hardships William had been addressing throughout the previous year. For the first time since beginning his expanded role, William found himself at the center of a constitutional crisis that required careful navigation between his duty to remain politically neutral and his responsibility to ensure stable governance. The situation was further complicated by the fact that his recent advocacy work had made him a more prominent public figure, with many looking to him for leadership during uncertain times. The crisis began on a cold January morning when opposition parties announced their intention to call for a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. The allegations centered on economic policies that had exacerbated the cost of living crisis, creating a direct connection to the issues William had been highlighting in his community visits. Media commentators immediately began speculating about the royal family's position, with some suggesting that William's advocacy work had implicitly criticized the government's response to the economic challenges. In the past, such political turbulence would have been handled entirely by King Charles, with established protocols governing the monarch's role in potential changes of government. But the gradual transition had created an unprecedented situation where both father and son might need to be involved in constitutional discussions with political leaders. The first indication of how serious the situation had become came during an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. The Prime Minister's private secretary had requested an urgent audience, and both King Charles and Prince William were present for the discussion. The conversation that followed would remain confidential, as required by constitutional convention, but its implications would ripple through the entire political establishment. What became clear in the days that followed was that the government's position was precarious, and there was a real possibility that the Prime Minister might need to resign or call for early elections. Either scenario would require careful constitutional management, with the monarchy playing its traditional role as the guarantor of stable transition between governments. For William, this crisis represented a crash course in one of the most complex aspects of constitutional monarchy, managing the relationship between the crown and elected government during times of political instability. He found himself studying constitutional precedents, consulting with legal experts, and preparing for scenarios that most future monarchs never have to contemplate until they actually ascend to the throne. The personal toll of the crisis was significant. William found himself working 18-hour days, balancing his existing royal duties with the additional constitutional responsibilities the political crisis demanded. Catherine stepped up to handle many of his scheduled engagements, but the pressure on their family life was immense. The children began to notice their father's increased stress and absence, leading to difficult conversations about duty, sacrifice, and the price of public service. One evening, as William was tucking George into bed after missing yet another family dinner due to urgent constitutional briefings, his eldest son asked a question that cut to the heart of his dilemma. "Daddy, if being king means you can't be with us, why do you want to do it?" The question forced William to articulate, perhaps for the first time, not just the duty he felt but the deeper sense of purpose that had emerged during his transition year. Because sometimes, George, the things that are most important are also the most difficult. Our family has been given a special responsibility to serve other families, especially when they need help the most. The conversation reminded William of similar talks his father had given him years earlier, but the context was different. Charles had spoken primarily about tradition and duty in abstract terms. William found himself explaining service in terms of real people: Sarah from Liverpool, the families he had met in food banks, the children whose futures depended on having leaders who understood their struggles. As the political crisis deepened, William's previous community engagement work took on new constitutional significance. Opposition leaders began citing his visits to struggling communities as evidence that even the royal family understood the government's failures. Government supporters argued that royal neutrality had been compromised by his advocacy work. Both interpretations made William uncomfortable, as they suggested his genuine desire to help people was being reduced to political ammunition. The tension reached its peak during a private meeting with the Prime Minister, who had requested a one-on-one discussion about the constitutional crisis. The conversation was frank and, sometimes uncomfortable, touching on the delicate balance between royal advocacy and political neutrality. "Your Royal Highness," the Prime Minister said, I understand your commitment to helping struggling families, and I respect that commitment. But some of your recent activities have been interpreted as criticism of government policy. That interpretation, whether accurate or not, is being used against us in Parliament. William's response would later be remembered as a defining moment in his evolution as a constitutional leader. Prime Minister, with respect, my role is not to make your political position easier or harder. My role is to serve the people of this country, regardless of which party is in power. If highlighting their struggles creates political difficulties for any government, then, perhaps those difficulties reflect real problems that need addressing. The exchange represented a new understanding of royal neutrality, not as passive disengagement from social issues, but as equal treatment of all political parties while maintaining focus on the welfare of the people they all claim to serve. It was a subtle but significant shift from traditional interpretations of constitutional monarchy. As Parliament prepared for the confidence vote, William found himself preparing for multiple scenarios. If the government fell, he might need to play a role in facilitating the formation of a new government. If early elections were called, he would need to maintain strict neutrality while continuing his advocacy work. Either way, he would be operating in uncharted territory for someone in his position. The night before the crucial vote, William walked through the gardens at Kensington Palace with Catherine, trying to process the magnitude of the responsibility he was carrying. The gradual transition that had seemed so carefully planned and manageable had become a trial by fire that was testing every aspect of his preparation for kingship. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the weight of her own concerns about their family's future. "I don't think anyone can ever be truly ready," William replied, "but I think we understand now what's at stake. It's not just about preserving an institution or maintaining tradition. It's about ensuring that the monarchy remains a force for stability and service when people need it most." The confidence vote, when it finally took place, was closer than many had predicted. The government survived, but by such a narrow margin that it was clear significant changes would be needed. For William, the result was almost secondary to what the crisis had revealed about his own readiness for kingship and the monarchy's evolving role in modern democracy. In the weeks that followed, both the government and opposition parties began reaching out to William in new ways, seeking his perspective on social issues while respecting constitutional boundaries. The crisis had established him as a figure who transcended traditional party politics while remaining deeply engaged with the challenges facing the country. The experience also deepened the relationship between William and his father. Charles, who had watched the crisis with evident anxiety about his son's political exposure, came to appreciate how William had managed to navigate the constitutional complexities while maintaining both neutrality and moral authority. The student had, in many ways, become the teacher. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the political crisis was the public's response. Polling conducted after the confidence vote showed that William's approval ratings had actually increased during the crisis, with many people expressing appreciation for what they saw as principled leadership during uncertain times. More importantly, there was growing public support for his approach to royal duty, with majorities in all age groups expressing preference for a more engaged monarchy over the traditional ceremonial model. The crisis had also revealed something important about the institution itself. The monarchy's stability and neutrality had not been compromised by more active engagement with social issues. Instead, the Crown's moral authority had been enhanced by demonstrating genuine concern for people's welfare while maintaining constitutional propriety. As spring arrived and the political situation stabilized, William reflected on how much had changed since his father first proposed the gradual transition. What had begun as a careful transfer of ceremonial duties had evolved into a fundamental reimagining of what modern monarchy could accomplish. The reluctant heir had become a confident leader, ready to assume the full weight of the crown when the time came. But, perhaps most importantly, the crisis had proven that the institution of monarchy could adapt and evolve without losing its essential character. The crown that had once seemed like an anachronistic relic of the past was proving itself to be a vital force for stability and service in the modern world. And, at the center of that transformation was a future king who had learned to see his destiny not as a burden to be endured, but as an opportunity to serve something greater than himself. 2 years after the gradual transition began, the moment everyone had been anticipating arrived, not with fanfare or formal ceremony, but with quiet dignity befitting the thoughtful process that had brought them to this point. King Charles, now 77 and, having successfully guided both his son and the institution through the most significant constitutional evolution in modern royal history, made the decision that would complete William's transformation from heir to monarch. The announcement came on a crisp September morning, delivered through a statement that reflected the measured, careful approach that had characterized the entire transition. After careful consideration and, with the full support of my family, the statement read, I have decided that the time has come to formally transfer the responsibilities of the crown to my son, Prince William. This decision reflects not any diminishment of my commitment to service, but rather my confidence in his readiness to lead our nation and Commonwealth into the future. The news sent ripples of surprise and anticipation throughout Britain and the Commonwealth realms. Unlike previous royal successions, which had come through death or dramatic abdication, this transition represented something unprecedented, a voluntary passing of the crown from a healthy, capable monarch to his equally prepared heir, based purely on what was best for the institution and the people it served. For William, the moment brought a complex mixture of emotions. The weight of destiny he had carried his entire life was finally becoming reality, but the gradual nature of the transition had allowed him to grow into the role rather than being thrust into it unprepared. Standing in his study at Adelaide Cottage, reading the statement that would change his life forever, he felt not the terror he had once imagined, but a profound sense of readiness and purpose. The conversation with Catherine that evening would remain one of their most private and precious memories. After putting the children to bed and ensuring they would not be disturbed, they sat together in their sitting room, processing what the announcement meant for their family, their marriage, and their future. Are you frightened? Catherine asked, taking his hand as she had done so many times during moments of uncertainty and transition. Strangely, no, William replied, surprising himself with his honesty. 2 years ago, I would have been terrified. But everything we've been through, every challenge we've faced, every crisis we've navigated, it's all been preparation for this moment. I feel ready in a way I never thought possible. The children's reactions reflected their different personalities and ages. George, now 12 and increasingly aware of his own future destiny, received the news with a solemnity that reminded both parents of William's own childhood awareness of his eventual role. Charlotte, ever empathetic, immediately asked what this would mean for their family life and whether they would still be able to have normal moments together. Louis, still young enough to be primarily concerned with immediate changes, wanted to know if they would have to move and whether his toys would come with them. The most challenging conversation was with George, who understood that his father's elevation to king meant his own future as heir was no longer a distant abstraction but an approaching reality. William and Catherine had prepared for this moment, but actually having the conversation proved more emotional than either had anticipated. Will I have to do what you've been doing? George asked, referring to the increased public duties and responsibilities he had observed his father taking on. Someday, yes, William replied honestly. But not for many, many years. You'll have time to grow up, to learn, to become the person you're meant to be before any of this becomes your responsibility. And, when that time comes, we'll make sure you're as ready as I feel now. The formal ceremony surrounding the transition would take place over several months, allowing for the complex constitutional and practical arrangements such a change required. The coronation was scheduled for the following spring, giving the new King William time to settle into his role before the elaborate ceremony that would mark his formal recognition as sovereign. In the meantime, the immediate changes were both symbolic and practical. The new King William V, as he would be known, moved his primary office to Buckingham Palace while maintaining Adelaide Cottage as the family's private residence. The balance between official duty and family life that had been so carefully constructed during the transition period would need to be maintained and even strengthened now that the full weight of the crown rested on his shoulders. The public response to the transition was overwhelmingly positive, reflecting the success of the gradual approach Charles and William had developed. Rather than shock or uncertainty about sudden change, there was widespread confidence in William's readiness for the role and appreciation for the thoughtful way the transition had been managed. International reaction was equally positive, with world leaders expressing confidence in the continuity of Britain's constitutional monarchy and the Commonwealth's stability. The gradual transition had allowed diplomatic relationships to evolve naturally, with many foreign leaders having already worked extensively with William in his expanded role as Prince of Wales. Perhaps the most meaningful response came from the communities William had visited during the economic crisis. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace from families like Sarah's in Liverpool, expressing gratitude not just for his advocacy during difficult times but for demonstrating that the monarchy could be both above politics and genuinely engaged with people's struggles. The first months of William's reign established patterns that would define his kingship. Weekly audiences with the Prime Minister continued the constitutional tradition while reflecting his more engaged approach to understanding government policy and its impact on ordinary people. State visits and official ceremonies maintained the pageantry and dignity expected of royal occasions while incorporating subtle changes that reflected contemporary values and priorities. Most significantly, King William continued and expanded the community engagement work that had characterized his preparation for the crown. Regular visits to food banks, homeless shelters, and community centers became not exceptional royal activities but integral parts of the monarchy's work. The crown's role as a symbol of national unity was enhanced by visible demonstration of concern for all citizens, regardless of their circumstances. The coronation, when it finally took place in Westminster Abbey, struck a perfect balance between honoring ancient traditions and acknowledging contemporary realities. The ceremony included all the historic elements that connected the new king to centuries of predecessors, but also featured representatives from the diverse communities that make up modern Britain. The guest list reflected William's approach to monarchy, traditional dignitaries alongside community leaders, heads of state alongside ordinary citizens who had made extraordinary contributions to their communities. Catherine's role as queen consort was defined with the same thoughtful approach that had characterized William's evolution. Her focus on children's welfare, mental health, and education provided a perfect complement to his broader social advocacy, creating a royal partnership that addressed society's challenges from multiple angles while respecting constitutional boundaries. The children adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable resilience, helped by their parents' determination to maintain as much normalcy as possible. George began receiving more formal instruction in constitutional history and royal duties, but always balanced with emphasis on his childhood and education. Charlotte and Louis continued their normal school routines, shielded as much as possible from the increased attention their family's elevation had brought. One of the most significant changes was in the relationship between the new King William and his father, the former King Charles. Charles retained the title of king but stepped back from official duties, serving as counselor and advisor to his son while finally having the opportunity to focus on personal interests that had been secondary to royal duties for so many decades. Their weekly meetings became treasured time for both men, opportunities for Charles to share the wisdom of his experience while watching his son grow into the role with confidence and innovation. The gradual transition had preserved not just institutional continuity but family relationships, avoiding the potential resentment or awkwardness that might have come from a more abrupt change. As William's first year as king drew to a close, the transformation that had begun with a tentative conversation at Highgrove House was complete. The reluctant heir had become a confident monarch, the institution had evolved without losing its essential character, and the British people had witnessed something unprecedented, a voluntary, gradual, and successful transition of royal power based purely on what served the nation's best interests. The boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, trying to disappear from public view, had become a king who understood that true leadership meant being visible when people needed hope, steady when they needed stability, and compassionate when they needed comfort. The crown that had once seemed like an unbearable burden had become a tool for service that could make a real difference in the world. Standing at the window of Buckingham Palace one evening, watching the lights of London twinkle in the distance, King William reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The weight of the crown was real, but so was the sense of purpose it provided. The monarchy his grandmother had served for over 70 years was in his hands now, and he was determined to prove worthy of both her legacy and the trust the people had placed in him. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges and opportunities, but William faced it with confidence earned through experience, wisdom gained through gradual preparation, and love provided by a family that had supported him every step of the way. The gradual transition had ended, but the real work of his reign was just beginning. And, for the first time in his life, the future King William had imagined was not something to fear, but something to embrace.